The 30 Years' War. The 30 Years' War, fought between 1618 and 1648, stands as one of the most brutal conflicts ever endured by soldiers. What began as a religious dispute within the Holy Roman Empire spiraled into a devastating continental struggle involving nearly every major European power. For the ordinary soldier, the experience was one of constant hunger, disease, and horrifying violence, often far more deadly than the battles themselves. The war's nature made it uniquely cruel. It wasn't a single, focused conflict, but a series of campaigns stretching across Central Europe for 3 decades. Soldiers marched endlessly, with little food and pay, often forced to forage or plunder from civilians. Armies lived off the land, which quickly meant starving villages and devastated farms. For the common conscript or mercenary, survival often depended less on skill in combat than on whether they could find something to eat. The conditions in camp were nightmarish. Disease spread faster than enemy gunfire. Dysentery, typhus, and plague cut down soldiers by the thousands, often more than combat did. With medical care almost non-existent, even small wounds could become fatal. Soldiers who deserted to escape misery risked hanging, while those who stayed faced endless campaigns in ruined countryside. When battles came, they were brutal but rare compared to the sieges and marches. Pike and shot formations clashed with musket fire and cannon blasts, while cavalry charges brought slaughter at close quarters. Sieges, however, were the worst. Months of starvation, bombardment, and exposure left soldiers weak, and once a city fell, massacres of both civilians and defenders were common. By the war's end, Germany was a wasteland. Estimates suggest that between 4 and 8 million people died, many of them soldiers. Survivors carried scars, disease, and memories of unimaginable suffering. For those who lived through it, the 30 Years' War was less a career than a prolonged death sentence. The Napoleonic Wars. From 1803 to 1815, Europe was engulfed in the Napoleonic Wars, a series of conflicts that brought unprecedented devastation and hardship to soldiers. While Napoleon Bonaparte is remembered for his brilliance as a commander, the reality for the men who fought under him and against him was grueling. Endless marches, horrific wounds, and a staggering death toll. Soldiers in the Napoleonic era endured extreme physical demands. Napoleon's armies were famed for their speed, covering more than 20 miles a day on foot, often with meager rations. Food was scarce, and many soldiers survived on whatever they could plunder from the countryside. Discipline was harsh. Desertion or looting could mean execution. For conscripts, many of them poor peasants, military service felt less like glory and more like an endless sentence of exhaustion and deprivation. Combat itself was brutal. Battles like Austerlitz, Borodino, and Waterloo saw tens of thousands killed or maimed in single days. Soldiers fought in tight formations, facing massed musket volleys and devastating artillery barrages. Cannon fire shredded ranks, while bayonet charges ended in hand-to-hand carnage. Field hospitals were overwhelmed, and medical care was primitive at best. Amputation without anesthesia was common, and infection killed more than the blade or bullet. Perhaps the worst ordeal was Napoleon's invasion of Russia in 1812. Of the 600,000 men who marched into Russia, only a fraction returned. Soldiers froze in the bitter winter, starved as supply lines collapsed, and were harried relentlessly by Russian forces. Accounts describe men eating horses, leather, and even one another to survive. For many, death from frostbite or disease was more likely than death from battle. By the war's end in 1815, millions of men had died across Europe. Survivors often returned home crippled, traumatized, or impoverished. While Napoleon's campaigns changed the map of Europe and reshaped modern warfare, the men who served in them paid a terrible price, caught between the ambitions of emperors and the brutal reality of 19th century battlefields. The American Civil War. From 1861 to 1865, the United States tore itself apart in a conflict that remains one of the bloodiest in its history. For soldiers on both sides, Union and Confederate, The American Civil War was a nightmare of disease, starvation, and industrialized slaughter that made it one of the worst wars to fight in. The sheer scale of suffering was staggering. Around 2.5 million men served in the Union Army and about 1.5 million in the Confederacy. Conditions in the camps were often worse than on the battlefield. Disease was the #1 killer. Dysentery, typhoid, malaria, and pneumonia spread rapidly through unsanitary camps. For every soldier killed in battle, nearly 2 more died of illness. Medical knowledge was primitive, and infection turned minor wounds into death sentences. The fighting itself was relentless and brutal. Battles such as Gettysburg, Antietam, and Shiloh left tens of thousands dead and wounded in just a few days. Soldiers fought with rifled muskets and cannons that caused devastating injuries. Massed infantry charges against entrenched positions often ended in horrific slaughter. Field hospitals overflowed, with amputations performed without anesthesia and survival rates frighteningly low. Beyond combat and disease, soldiers faced starvation and exposure. Confederate soldiers especially suffered as supply lines broke down late in the war. Diaries speak of men marching barefoot, wrapped in rags against the cold, or boiling shoe leather for food. Prison camps like Andersonville became hellish places where thousands died from hunger and neglect. Psychological trauma also left deep scars. Many soldiers returned home physically mutilated and emotionally shattered, carrying memories of fields littered with corpses and comrades lost to disease or cannon fire. For those who endured it, the Civil War was not just a battle between North and South. It was a daily struggle against hunger, disease, and the machinery of death. The Crimean War. From 1853 to 1856, the Crimean War dragged soldiers into one of the most miserable and mismanaged conflicts of the 19th century. Fought between Russia and an alliance of Britain, France, the Ottoman Empire, and later Sardinia, the war was notorious not only for battlefield brutality, but for the horrific conditions endured by ordinary troops. The most infamous part of the conflict was the shocking lack of planning and logistics. Soldiers often marched into battle without proper uniforms, shelter, or food. Harsh winters in Crimea brought freezing temperatures that killed thousands from exposure. Supplies sat rotting in ports while men in the trenches starved or froze. Letters from British troops describe living in mud-filled holes, with disease and vermin as constant companions. Cholera, dysentery, and typhus swept through camps, killing more soldiers than bullets or cannon fire. Medical care was nearly non-existent. The sick and wounded lay in filthy hospitals, often without bandages or basic sanitation. It was during this war that Florence Nightingale emerged as a pioneering nurse, horrified by the conditions and determined to reform them. Battle itself was equally grim. Outdated tactics met with modern weaponry, and soldiers paid the price. At battles such as Alma, Balaclava, and Inkerman, thousands died in chaotic charges and desperate hand-to-hand fighting. The infamous Charge of the Light Brigade epitomized the futility of the war, a suicidal cavalry assault caused by miscommunication that left more than half the men dead or wounded in just minutes. For the common soldier, the Crimean War was less about honor and more about survival. Between poor leadership, appalling medical support, and constant disease, many felt abandoned by the very governments that sent them to fight. Though the war ended with an Allied victory, it left a legacy of suffering, death, and outrage that exposed the cost of neglecting the basic needs of soldiers in battle. World War I. From 1914 to 1918, World War I dragged millions of soldiers into a conflict so brutal that it became known as the War to End All Wars. For those in the trenches, life was an endless nightmare of mud, disease, and industrialized death on a scale the world had never seen before. The battlefield conditions were appalling. Soldiers lived for months in narrow, waterlogged trenches stretching hundreds of miles across Europe. Rats thrived on the corpses that piled up in no man's land, while lice tormented men who rarely changed clothes. Trench foot, caused by standing in cold, wet conditions for days, rotted flesh and left men crippled. In winter, frostbite was common. In summer, Disease spread quickly through the stinking trenches. The combat itself was relentless and dehumanizing. Artillery dominated the war, with shells raining down day and night, pulverizing earth and bodies alike. Soldiers often lived in fear of being buried alive by bombardments. Machine guns made frontal assaults suicidal, cutting down entire waves of men in seconds. Poison gas, chlorine, phosgene, and mustard gas introduced a new horror, burning lungs and blinding eyes. Masks offered limited protection, and a single leak could be fatal. Major battles such as the Somme, Verdun, and Passchendaele left staggering casualties. At the Somme alone, more than 1 million men were killed or wounded. Soldiers who survived carried both physical injuries and deep psychological trauma. What was then called shell shock left many men trembling, mute, or mentally broken, what today we would recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. For many soldiers, the greatest enemy wasn't just the opposing army, but hopelessness itself. Weeks of monotony could be shattered in moments by unimaginable violence. By the end of the war, nearly 10 million soldiers had been killed, and survivors returned to a world that could not understand the scale of their suffering. For those who fought, World War I was not only a test of courage, but a prolonged struggle for sanity in a mechanized hellscape. World War II. From 1939 to 1945, World War II became the deadliest conflict in human history, and for soldiers, it was a living nightmare on every front. More than 100 million people served in uniform, and over 20 million of them never came home. For those who fought, the war combined industrialized killing, extreme conditions, and atrocities that pushed the human body and mind beyond breaking. On the Eastern Front, soldiers endured some of the most brutal combat ever recorded. The Battle of Stalingrad alone cost nearly 2 million lives. German and Soviet troops faced starvation, frostbite, and street-to-street fighting in a shattered city where corpses froze in the snow. Survival often meant eating rats, leather, or even human flesh. Prisoners were rarely spared. Many were executed or left to die in camps. In the Pacific, jungle warfare brought its own horrors. Soldiers contended with oppressive heat, malaria, dysentery, and venomous wildlife alongside relentless Japanese resistance. At battles like Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, men stormed beaches under artillery and machine gun fire, watching comrades fall in waves before gaining a few bloody yards of sand. Japanese defenders, often fighting to the last man, turned every cave and ridge into a death trap. In Europe, Allied soldiers who landed on D-Day faced machine gun nests, minefields, and artillery on the beaches of Normandy. Airmen risked death daily in bombing raids, with casualty rates so high that some units had less than a 20% chance of surviving a full tour. Beyond combat, soldiers witnessed the worst of humanity. Liberating concentration camps exposed them to the industrialized murder of millions. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki showed the terrifying new scale of destruction unleashed by modern science. For the men who fought, World War II meant endless marches, frozen trenches, tropical swamps, and killing on an unprecedented scale. By its end, the war left not only physical scars, but also deep psychological trauma that shaped an entire generation. The Korean War fought from 1950 to 1953. The Korean War is often called the Forgotten War, but for the soldiers who endured it, there was nothing forgettable about the misery. This conflict between North Korea, backed by China and the Soviet Union, and South Korea, supported by the United States and United Nations forces, was a grinding struggle of extremes. Brutal winters, relentless combat, and staggering casualties. The Korean Peninsula's terrain was one of the first enemies soldiers faced. Towering mountains, dense forests, and harsh weather made every campaign a nightmare. Summers brought sweltering heat and malaria-ridden swamps, while winters dropped to bone-cracking cold that froze weapons and flesh alike. Frostbite, trench foot, and malnutrition plagued troops. Veterans recall long nights in foxholes, shivering in thin uniforms while shells thundered overhead. Combat was relentless and punishing. The early months saw sweeping advances by both sides, with armies overrunning each other's positions across hundreds of miles. When Chinese forces entered in late 1950, wave attacks of thousands of soldiers slammed into UN lines, often at night. At battles such as Chosin Reservoir, U.S. Marines fought their way out of encirclement, while enduring temperatures as low as 40 below zero, leaving many frozen as well as wounded. The psychological strain was immense. Soldiers fought in a war where front lines shifted constantly, making victories feel temporary. Guerrilla warfare added to the danger as ambushes and night raids kept men in constant fear. Prisoners of war endured harsh captivity, with starvation and indoctrination common. By the armistice in 1953, more than 1 million soldiers from all sides were dead, with millions more civilians caught in the crossfire. For survivors, the Korean War left lasting scars, frostbitten limbs, psychological trauma, and memories of endless mountains and relentless enemies. It was a war of attrition, where misery and endurance defined the soldiers' experience as much as bravery or firepower. Passchendaele, 1917. In the summer and autumn of 1917, Allied forces launched the Third Battle of Ypres, remembered today as Passchendaele. Fought between July and November in Belgium, it was one of the most brutal campaigns of World War I. For soldiers, it meant months of misery, mud, and slaughter, with little to show for the sacrifice. The battlefield itself was a death trap. Heavy rains and relentless shelling destroyed drainage systems, turning the low-lying ground into an endless quagmire. Soldiers found themselves wading through knee-deep mud, sometimes chest-deep, with equipment dragging them down. Entire platoons disappeared when men slipped into flooded shell craters, unable to climb out. Boots, rifles, and even horses were swallowed whole by the sucking mire. Combat was unrelenting. German forces held strong defensive positions in pillboxes and machine gun nests. Every Allied advance across no man's land meant crawling slowly over shattered ground under constant artillery fire. Soldiers were weighed down by sodden uniforms and clogged weapons, their bodies breaking down from exhaustion, frostbite, and trench foot. Even basic survival was a daily battle against cold, hunger, and infection. The human toll was staggering. By the time the campaign ended, the Allies had advanced barely 5 miles at a cost of more than 250,000 casualties. German losses were similarly devastating. The gain of a small village named Passchendaele, sitting on a ridge, became the symbolic victory. Though few soldiers. Passchendaele, 1917. In the summer and autumn of 1917, Allied forces launched the Third Battle of Ypres, remembered today as Passchendaele. Fought between July and November in Belgium, it was one of the most brutal campaigns of World War I. For soldiers, it meant months of misery, mud, and slaughter, with little to show for the sacrifice. The battlefield itself was a death trap. Heavy rains and relentless shelling destroyed drainage systems, turning the low-lying ground into an endless quagmire. Soldiers found themselves wading through knee-deep mud, sometimes chest-deep, with equipment dragging them down. Thank you for watching. If you learned anything, let me know with a like, and comment below on what you would like to see in the future. History never runs out of surprises, and neither do we. So subscribe and join me for the next dive into the archives.